Um, Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This is a really exciting panel, not just for everyone here. I mean, I'm speaking for everyone, but also for me. So I'll just do a short introduction of what we're here for, and then we'll get right to it. So some of you might know that it's Neurodiversity Celebration Week, and part of that, these kinds of awareness weeks is to recognize different aspects of groups that we're celebrating. And I think today we have a very special way of celebrating that by asking questions from people who are either influenced by or identify as neurodivergent, specifically in the field of mathematics, to um, explore the topic of what neurodiversity looks like. And so today we'll start with our three panelists here. We have Irfan Alam, Sarah Tillman, and Daniel Reinholz. And I just want to thank all three of you for joining us today. I will not be introducing you too much because I know you'll be introducing yourself, so leave it to you to do that. But before we begin, I did want to share with everyone here and in our audience and on YouTube Live a little bit about what we're looking at doing today. So I'll just be sharing my screen here so everyone can see. Okay, so for our agenda today, we'll be starting with some reflections from our wonderful panelists. There'll be about 5 minutes where they will share their own testimonials of neurodiversity and their experience with it. Followed by that, we'll have a moderated panel discussion. So we have some guided questions that we'll be sharing to prompt what will hopefully be a lively discussion between our panelists and hopefully be also interesting to our audience. And finally, we'll also have an audience discussion. So we do encourage that our audiences do kind of take part and participate with us. So please note that whenever you have a question as we're going through our first two segments, please do send them in I will actually share how you'll be sending them in. But essentially, if you have certain questions that come up for you and you would like to reflect on them, please feel free to share them. So like I said, we do encourage participation. So for your questions, we recommend that you type into our Zoom chat box, as well as on YouTube Live if you're streaming there. And this is also for anybody who might be in our Zoom chat but has to leave or maybe is having trouble and isn't in the chat in our Zoom session anymore. We do have the QR code right there if you'd like to log back in. But also, if you do get logged out, we also have our YouTube live stream on our Eventbrite. So please feel free to go back in there and connect with us that way. Once our two segments of the moderated discussions are over, we will be collecting your questions and calling your name out directly along with your questions so you can participate directly. Please feel free to briefly introduce yourself. And I will be bringing this up again periodically just as a reminder, but if you choose not to participate directly, we will just mention your name and ask your question on your behalf. So both ways are here for you, so please do whatever is comfortable for you. And finally, I promise we're at the end of our housekeeping, some engagement rules. Before we begin, please check if your mic is muted. This will ensure that there's no feedback and we're able to have our discussions, especially when someone else is speaking. If you haven't changed your login name, please name it to what you'd like to be addressed as, because when we collect your questions, we'll also be looking at your names. And we will also be sharing a follow-up survey at the end of our session with the YouTube live stream again that you can watch in the end, just so we can hear some of your thoughts. So please stay tuned for that. So with that, I'll just stop sharing here. And yeah, thank you for that kind of long-winded introduction, but I just wanted to make sure that we were all aligned. But yeah, without further ado, I will start with our first panelist. I'll start in alphabetical order. So maybe we'll start with you, Daniel.
Hey everyone, thank you, Namista, and thank you to everyone organizing this wonderful session. I'm super happy to be here. So I'm Daniel Reinholz. I'm a professor in the Department of Math and Statistics at San Diego State University. I'm also autistic and have multiple disabilities. And for me, sort of those experiences of disability and neurodivergence have been related throughout my whole life. And I know others also have that same experience. For me, I spent most of my life not knowing that I was autistic. It wasn't until actually the COVID pandemic, when my family was sick with COVID, that I read a blog post by an autistic mathematician. And there were a lot of things in there that sounded very familiar to me. And it sort of got me down the rabbit hole of reading things online and looking into disability justice and actually getting a formal diagnosis at that point. And so when that happened, I think a lot of things clicked in my life, a lot of things shifted. Just seeing how disability in general was handled during COVID was shocking, honestly, in a lot of ways, and shifted in my professional work, kind of a recognition that there was a lot more work that needed to be done, and it was something I could focus on. And it also, like, my past, in the past 30 years, suddenly made a lot more sense in retrospect. Like, I'm a drummer, and I didn't recognize like how drumming was a form of stimming as one example, or hyper focus, or just forms of communication. So really, that was just a wonderful insight and discovery for me. And for me, I tend to think of disability, neurodiversity broadly, as an opportunity. There are challenges, right? And some of those come from just how we are and who we are, and some of those come from society. But there's also strengths and opportunities. And I think far too often, the world around us just focuses on the challenges and doesn't see the strengths. And so I'm really glad to be here so we can talk about some of those things today. For me, academia can be a challenging space because of ableism, because of really difficult standards for productivity, a lot of these things that we face. And on the flip side, there's also flexibility. And so I've been able to sort of carve a path that works for me and my body and my mind. And, for example, I don't attend a lot of plenary sessions because being packed in a room with 500 people and not moving in your desk, for an hour is difficult. And it's not my favorite thing. So that's about all I want to say. I'm writing a book right now, actually, on disability and neurodivergence in the history of math. So I'll probably talk about that more later, but I'm really excited to be here, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing, Daniel, and can't wait to dig deeper into some of the things you just shared. Next, we'll go with Irfan.
Yeah, hi, I'm Irfan. I'm a postdoc at University of Toronto, Scarborough. I learned about neurodivergence, I know I learned about it in 2022 because I was getting diagnosed for autism then. So I was just out of my PhD in math. And that was around that time I was having various difficulties, social difficulties. And I think getting diagnosed was very helpful in understanding how I always had those difficulties growing up, and I sort of was always in environments where I eventually learned how to cope by masking and by being very direct if I'm in an academic setting. So in academic settings can sometimes be very helpful to autistic people, I think, because especially in math, you just have to be very direct about what you are communicating mathematically, and if your math is good, then you do get opportunities. But on the flip side, many people, many autistic people, I can even imagine in my own life, might not have had the same opportunities to pursue maths, simply because there were all sorts of barriers to entry, like this entrance exam or that entrance exam or interview and so on. And it's difficult for some people over there. Now, getting diagnosed as an adult is kind of a challenge, both for the person getting diagnosed and the person diagnosing you, because not all psychiatrists or psychologists are even trained to diagnose adults. They have to look into the childhood history a lot to be able to diagnose people. In my childhood, I was bullied a lot in school. I have written about this elsewhere. And I've told this story actually to several people in this group before, that there was one instance in fourth grade, which somehow kind of flipped the switch. So what I'll do in my remaining 1 or 2 minutes is share some report cards that I asked my mother and sister to dig up last night. So I'll share my screen. So are you all seeing my report cards? Okay, good. So in India, they don't say grade 1, they call class 1 or first class. So in class 1, you can see I was more or less okay. So I was good, A plus, A in some things, B plus in some things. So I was average. Then let's go to class 2. You see an occasional C somewhere, but still more or less okay, A plus, B plus, and so on. And so class 3 is similar. I will skip that. Now, class 4 is the interesting thing. So in math, I consistently got C a few times in various things, and then one isolated A, and then several Bs, then again more Cs. Now, I distinctly remember when the third term results were announced, the teacher put my answer sheet up to the class and said that, look, see how anyone can be good at math. You just have to practice and uh, work on it. So he was using me as an example to show how a C student can become an A student. And in my mind, I was thinking, this is so stupid. It's just my father taught me the concepts yesterday. And so I did better this time than previously. And since then, my father taught me more and more math. So I owe a lot to my father for teaching me for most of school. And then after that, I just learned because of the opportunities I got. So that's my story.
All right, I guess that leaves me. I'm Sarah. I'm experiencing a lot of anxiety right now, but I'm trying to get better at doing scary things. My background is pretty different from that of our other two panelists, both because I got a lot of my diagnoses when I was very young. My first autism diagnosis was when I was about 5 years old, but my first disability diagnosis in general was when I was maybe 6 months old. So I have been, getting accommodations and services my whole life. I started needing accommodations in school around middle school, didn't start getting them until high school. That was fun. But I've noticed that in conversations about neurodiversity, there's often a really heavy focus on autism and ADHD, and a lot of other neurodivergences kind of get left out. So I am going to be focusing on a different neurodivergence that I have, which is my slow processing speed. It's basically what it sounds like. My brain processes information very, very slowly. Once I have processed a piece of information, I can understand it as well as the next person. It takes me a long time to do a lot of things, which would be fine, except that we live in a society that kind of assumes that part of being good at things is doing them quickly. So if you're slow at things, often people think you're not trying or you're just not good at those things, even if all you need is more time. And our education system is no different, right? Like tests are timed, everything has a deadline. the farther you get in your education, the more work you're expected to be able to complete in the same amount of time. Like the school year doesn't get any longer, but there's so much more work by the time you get to grad school, right? Sometimes the only difference between a regular class and an honors or gifted class is how much homework you're assigned. That doesn't make sense. And there are accommodations for it, right? You can get extended time on tests, and that really does help. The homework is where it gets tricky because you can devote more of your free time to doing your homework, in which case you become chronically sleep deprived. Or you can get extensions on all your deadlines, in which case you fall farther and farther behind with each assignment because the extra time you're taking on each assignment eats into your time on the next assignment. So it's no wonder that I had a migraine for most of grad school. I was just always behind, always sleep deprived. It was very stressful. I was in burnout by the time I graduated, and I still haven't completely recovered. It's not all bad, obviously. I love being neurodivergent. I love being autistic. I love being ADHD. I love the neurodivergent community in general. But there are obviously issues with our education system that are keeping people like me from succeeding. I'm the only panelist here who doesn't have a PhD. And I think the lack of accommodation for, my slow processing speed and my ability or my need to take more time to do things is mainly what caused me to not be able to get a PhD. So I don't know how we fix that, but I do know that we can't fix it until a lot more people know that it's an issue. So here I am letting you all know that it's an issue. That's pretty much all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Irfan and Daniel, for sharing some things that I feel like any and every neurodivergent person, including myself, would resonate with. Before we move on, I also wanted to introduce myself as your moderator and to our audience. So about myself, I am Namista. I'm originally from Bangladesh, and I was diagnosed with ADHD as an adult. And I wanted to share that because some of the questions that we're going to be getting into next focus a lot on neurodivergence, and I have personally experienced a lot of them. So some of my questions are definitely based on my lived experience. But yeah, I just wanted to share that I do resonate with a lot of the things that all of you have said. So thank you for that. Before we move on, just a quick reminder that to our audience and everyone watching on YouTube, please do share your questions. We'll be moving into our panel discussion next, but we'll be with you and asking some of your, or letting you ask some of your questions right after. All right, so some great stuff to dig into here. And again, thank you so much for being vulnerable and sharing with us your personal experiences. From what I noticed in all of your accounts is that tension between your experience as a neurodivergent and reclaiming it as a way to look at opportunities versus the world kind of saying that it's not a feature, it's a bug. That's kind of the tension that we're seeing in our external world with our internal world. When it came to your academics or your professional life or your personal life, how would you talk about that tension a little bit more? So for example, how would you see it as a feature rather than a bug for yourself versus the world saying it's a bug, but you don't see it that way, if that makes sense? Maybe I'll start with Daniel.
Sure, yeah, thank you for that question. So I think a lot of what I think about is that there's sort of this normative expectation in society that being different in certain ways or certain things are okay. Like it's okay to be narcissistic, or it's okay to be this, or it's okay to be these other things, but forms of neurodivergence, maybe, oh, you don't make eye contact the same way, or other things are sort of put in this bucket as like not okay. And that's just sort of a societal decision So for me, when I think about neurodivergence in my own experience, I can only speak to my own experience, and well said, Sarah. Like, neurodiversity means are a wide range of different experiences that people are coming from. I think things like attention to logical structure and routine, these sort of almost like stereotypical autistic traits, I find are very helpful when thinking about mathematics. It just, when I was a kid, like a lot of things, particularly interested in math, to be honest. But a lot of things just came quickly for me. And I was just like, oh, the other kids are not trying, they don't get it, it's so obvious. And then I was like, much later I realized, well, actually, maybe I had sort of some innate that could be worked on. I think in the context of academia, I think there's a lot more neurodiversity in academia than people recognize or is diagnosed. Whether we need diagnosis is different, but the ability to like work on the same kind of thing for decades takes a certain type of person who is willing to do that, right? Or is able to do that. So I think, to me, broadly in math, being able to look at the same problem in different ways, whether that's through a lens of neurodiversity, a different disability, or whether that's applying techniques from a geometry to an algebraic problem, right? Sort of having these different lenses is important, right? And so it doesn't mean it's going to be an advantage in all cases, but it's helpful sometimes. And I think focusing on that fact means that we might see things, or an individual might find something that somebody else doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a divergent way of thinking that you would expect in a research or academic field, because that's where innovation and progress lies. So it's interesting that sometimes we do have to push back on that because there's a very standardized form of what that looks like for people. And so one of the things that we talk about in some of our relatorium discussions outside of our seminars is around that formalism versus a more unstructured, intuitive way of finding those innovations, right? I want to shift back to Irfan now, because I feel like from what I've heard, Irfan, one thing you said in your personal testimonial really stood out to me, which is that you talked about how being autistic actually helped you in being in mathematics and academia. Could you describe a little bit more about that? Because it feels like it's almost on a different side of what some of our other panelists have shared.
Well, it has both good and I should not say good and bad, but it has both helpful and unhelpful features, right? So as Daniel also mentioned, the autistic people are pretty good in general of recognizing structures in the world around them. They are very logical people, and math is about recognizing structures, right? So I feel like as I was showing my report cards, the times when I have had difficulties in math, let's say up to third grade, were not necessarily because I was not good at math or I could not recognize structures, but because I just did not know what they were asking. Uh, and a lot of it has to do with notation. A lot of it has to do with not properly communicating what notation means, and so on. And once my father started teaching me more regularly, I was just very good. Um, and now part of it is also that I had the opportunity of getting taught by my father, and anyone who has good teacher perhaps would be better at math than they would be otherwise. But eventually I also just started learning on my own through books. So once math is the kind of subject where once you have reached a certain amount of sophistication, you can pretty much just teach yourself anything. You just need enough time and resources and stability in life to focus on it, right? So yeah, I think it has helped me a lot. It has hurt me in the sense that I can tend to write things so rigorously and formally just to be sure that I know what I'm doing. That it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of energy, and sometimes you don't have both of those things in academia.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, that tension of our experiences and seeing how it fits into the path that we're on. And you actually, to us, highlight a really important thing, which is in order for our strengths to be recognized or brought to its full potential, we do need alternative ways of being taught. We need alternative support systems, and that can really help us excel when the standard pathway in front of us maybe doesn't quite fit the toolbox that we have. And it's also really resonating with me because I had a very similar report card throughout my entire life where I'd be in the 90th percentile when it came to languages, and then I'd be under the 50th percentile no matter how much I tried to study for math. And that really put me off math because all I heard was, you just aren't practicing enough. And I'm like, I just don't get it. So it's really wonderful to hear that your dad put you on that path and brought you where you are today. And of course you did as well, because you found what clicked for you. Sarah, I want to shift to you now because I feel the neurodivergence that you wanted to share about your slow processing speed can maybe at first glance seem like that it's definitely not fit for a very efficient-based society, let's say, that we're in. But I wonder if I could flip that for you just from your personal experience, if you could share with us, how have you found that that is actually a strength? And if accommodations were made, that could be a strength even in academia.
That is a tricky one because honestly, I feel positively about all of my neurodivergences except that one. I haven't found a situation yet where it's advantageous to process information slowly because my comprehension is unaffected, right? It's not like I understand things better because I'm processing them slowly. I'm just processing them slowly. I will say that, obviously I should not do any jobs where emergencies are happening and things have to happen very quickly. But I can still, I have had jobs before. I'm looking for a job right now, but I can still do good work. It just can't be super fast. My editing speed is almost exactly the same as my reading speed, to get off the topic of math a little bit, because the editing part of my brain never turns off. So I edit at a reasonable pace. Math will always be slow for me. And for the most part, I'm just okay with that, except when there are pressing deadlines. But I'm autistic and ADHD. I have the ability to hyper focus on a math problem for probably longer than I should, but it's really fun. And I really enjoy getting into the math like that. So yeah, there are definitely advantages and disadvantages to being neurodivergent. If anyone knows of any advantages to having slow processing speed, I would love to hear them. I haven't found any yet, but there are certainly advantages to my other neurodivergences.
Thank you for sharing, Sarah. And I think it was maybe me trying to kind of understand if there's something that you have, because I do feel that across the board with neurodivergence, because of how the standard is a certain level of speed, and that is faster, 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 I think maybe each and every one of us and members of the neurodivergent population have noticed that at a certain point you do hit what your saturation is. And it doesn't matter how you are, you do hit that, and then you're limited to that speed, and it does get slower. Because I have definitely faced and resonated with the burnout that you talk about, where I'm constantly behind on things, especially with my ADHD. When it comes to life admin stuff, I'm the worst at it. I recently moved, and it feels like it's a long corridor that's never going to end. And I think that does make a lot of people feel similarly. But yeah, I think ultimately, like you said, I think every person comes with different strengths and weaknesses, and it's about celebrating them and seeing how to accommodate for some of the things rather than feeling like it's now a doomed characteristic that we have, sort of thing. So I really appreciate you looking at it in different ways. One other thing, so this next question is around this interesting thing where we have Daniel and Irfan who were diagnosed later in life versus you, Sarah, who was diagnosed earlier in life. So I want to ask Irfan and Daniel, and whoever wants to go first, how do you feel this, because you both talked about how knowing about it later in life helped you reflect on how you went through your life and so many things made sense. Could you speak more to that and also speak to what could have been different had you been diagnosed earlier in life? Touchy one, I know.
I can speak. So for me, I think the most important thing to learn was how most of my behavior was kind of a function of how I learned how to behave not to get punished. Like what was happening around me and how I learned from that if I do this, then I will not be punished. And uh, by punished, I mean not punished by parents or I should have said bullied actually. So I was showing my report card. So that fourth grade incident that I mentioned, I also sort of vaguely remember, I don't remember things very precisely, but I vaguely remember that shortly after that incident, I was bullied less. And so I learned, oh yeah, okay. So if you are good at math, you get bullied less. And part of the reason was that the students bullying you actually now needed your help. They were like, oh, can you do this homework problem for me and so on. And so they didn't bully me now, but they would just get help from me. And so I was like, yeah, this is a better life. And so yeah, I just started doing that. And to this day, I feel like I am in academia partly because I love math and I want to do it, but partly because I just don't think I would survive in other places because here uh, you kind of once you reach the like a certain stage, you kind of do get some allowance for being flexible on your time. Like once you have completed your coursework and stuff, because you can do your research at night if you need to, and so on. You don't always have set hours to meet people, depending on who you're working with. So a lot depends on how flexible the people around you who are working with you are with you. But yeah, had I somehow been diagnosed as a child, I feel like just because of the location I was in India, they might have just thought I cannot be good at anything. I know someone young in my town who, uh, well, he has more special needs. He has a lot more challenges. But even someone like me who technically could have learned math, but just having the label of autism would uh, make it seem to society that I cannot learn math and I would not even get the opportunities that I did get.
Yeah. And I think it brings back to some of the things you said around ableism, Daniel, but maybe you can share a little bit about your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. This is also interesting to be on the panel for me because now I've been in academia for a while. You know, I feel very privileged to have gone through, have tenure, have some of those securities to be able to talk about this. And if you would have talked to me a decade ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I think the conversation would be very different from my point of view, right? Because I would be much more focused on the many struggles along the way. I think this alludes to a later question, but I'm really grateful to sort of autism and activism and the neurodiversity movement, disability justice, a lot of pushing to sort of destigmatize um, neurodiversity broadly, because when I think almost 40 years ago, the situation was just fundamentally different, right? So when I talk to younger folks today about autism or neurodiversity, they're in a very different space, right? There's more awareness. There's still stigma, but I also think there's more acceptance now, at least in certain contexts, not in all contexts. Um, and so it's hard to think like, do I have to go back to, awareness when I was a child or awareness now? But I think a couple of things that just came up for me when you brought up that question is growing up, and perhaps in ways today, but especially growing up, social things were just always hard. And it was always trying to be in these group situations or other things, never quite fitting in, never not really knowing why. You're trying to be a part of something, but like just kind of either explicitly or kind of in quiet ways being excluded from that. I think is very difficult when you're young, you're trying to build your identity, your self-confidence, and you're just somehow feel that you don't belong. So I think having more understanding of that, maybe it would have been easier to find my people, so to speak, in those situations. I think knowledge is power. Understanding both what your strengths are and what your challenges are, I think is just useful, because I think it allows you to lean into those strengths. And I grew up in rural America, not a lot of awareness about a lot of things, honestly, not a lot of resources. So I do wonder what it would be like to be in a situation where, for example, oh, you seem to have aptitude towards this thing. We're going to create resources and opportunities for you to do that thing, because that wasn't my experience, right? It was kind of fumbling my way through. I dropped out of high school at one point and sort of cobbling my path back into academia through this very nonlinear path. And then I can tell a story about it now, but it wasn't coherent for the 35 years or more that I was on that academic path. And so I think that's, to me, where like awareness is a good thing. Neurodiversity is it's not rare, right? It's actually very common in our experiences of human variation, and it's all like we pathologize it, but it's like it's all around us. And so I think we need to accept and embrace and support that rather than sort of stigmatizing.
Absolutely agree. Um, and yeah, I think that's why these discussions and being able to engage with and share our own stories is so important, to just see how there are actually, like, this divergence is quite common, even though the term is used as divergence. It really is diversity, isn't it? Sarah, shifting back to you, would love to hear your perspective on knowing early on some of the features that are in your toolbox and how that's affected where you are today.
Yeah, so like I said, I got most of my diagnoses when I was pretty young. I was 5 when I was diagnosed with autism and ADHD. It was PDD-NOS at the time, pervasive development disorder, not otherwise specified, but that's on the autism spectrum. I didn't find out about any of them really until I was 12, though. And when I did find out, the information I was given was fairly negative. Autism was framed as a bunch of deficits. ADHD was framed as a bunch of deficits. It was all very deficit based. And so I was happy to have these labels to apply to myself because I could explain to people why I was struggling. But I didn't have a lot of positive feelings toward my neurodivergences at the time because I didn't know that there were positive aspects to them. It wasn't until I got to maybe late high school, early college that I encountered, the neurodiversity movement, the social model of disability, and realized that one, there's nothing actually bad about being disabled. It just means that society isn't accessible enough to you. And two, every brain type has advantages and disadvantages. I've already mentioned my main disadvantage is that I process information slowly, but I'm very good at pattern recognition. I got the overly logical autism, so that has made me pretty good at math, especially when math became more and more about proving things. So there are these obvious, to me at least, advantages to being neurodivergent as well, but I didn't see them when I was younger because nobody had told me about them.
Yeah. And I think it touches on an interesting thing that I've personally experienced, and I see that all of you have as well. A friend of mine and I, we were diagnosed pretty late. So I was actually diagnosed by a friend who had ADHD. And they're like, you have it. You need to go. You just need to go. And so once I got my diagnosis, I went to my childhood friend and said, so I think. So it was kind of a train of people getting diagnoses within the span of 3 years because we'd just been hanging out and loving each other for such a long time. And finally realizing it was because we had so much in common, all the way up to our brains, right? And I think one of the things we do talk about, because we are all from different countries that do not specifically have accommodations for these kinds of things, we did grow up hearing a lot more about what we're bad at, to the point where by the time we reached adulthood, we weren't quite sure what we were good at. And so the last few years have been us trying to figure out what are we good at and why don't we celebrate that more, and breaking that internal loop of that experience in order to see what we're actually working with, rather than hyper-focusing, because we can all hyper-focus, can't we? And ruminating on all the things that we're not really that good at. And this brings me to some of the comments that we have through our YouTube. We have, I'll just read it out, at Lance Zavon Korad 4084. And they say, I mean, I may have to wait till I'm older to really experience struggles, but as an autistic teen, I love my autism. It allows me to be completely obsessed with math and other academic stuff, which is so wonderful. And I'm so glad to hear that we do have teenagers and other people who are earlier in their experience, who are growing up, learning the strengths of it, because I think that perspective shift really does put us on a different path. We also have Vanessa Shatman sharing, also worth mentioning that not every neurodivergent trait necessarily has to have a positive side. I have auditory and tactile sensory issues that aren't anything but a hassle. And I think maybe, Sarah, that was in regards to what you were saying. And I think absolutely, Vanessa, sometimes it's just about us accepting who we are. And the acceptance is more important than turning everything into a strength or superpower, which is, again, going back to that kind of efficiency-based system and economy that we work in. Lance, also, I'll just call you Lance, I'm sorry. They are also saying that I got the seeing connections between seemingly disparate concepts autism, LOL. And I think, to a degree, I've noticed that every neurodivergent person has a really beautiful way of bringing in connections that you might not have thought of. For example, that makes me really good at gift giving, because I remember things no one even thinks about. I'm wondering, to tie that thread, asking some of you, what are some ways that you found that your autism or your ADHD or your neurodivergence in some way brought this quirk that gave you actually a lot of delight, whether that was at work or outside of it? Whoever wants to go.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was talking about how, like, being able to see disparate patterns can actually show up in interesting ways and add a lot of delight to both your life and other people's. So, for example, I can remember random things and turn them into some of the best birthday gifts for people in ways that they're like, how did you think about this? Because I hyper-focused on making them happy for some reason by remembering random things and putting them together. I'm wondering some of those traits, and it doesn't have to be like mine, which is personal. Can you think of a certain experience where your neurodivergence came together in a really delightful way for you?
My first thought is I have a sensory processing disorder, which is sometimes very not fun. But it also means that when there's a good texture, oh boy, is there a good texture. I love soft things. They make me so, 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 so happy. And I imagine that I get more joy out of soft things than the average person because they just feel so good.
I recognized this very recently that I have that too. And so I've been hardcore getting rid of many things in my home because I'm like, I don't like this anymore. Irfan, Daniel.
So I was actually initially not sure what I would say to this question, but then I remembered that Daniel mentioned how when he got diagnosed, he learned he could be a drummer. Is that right, Daniel?
I was always a drummer, but I didn't know why I was always drumming on everything all the time.
I see. Yeah, so I think I was kind of like that. I've never actually gotten a drum, but I did pick up my piano again, a keyboard again. I was taking piano classes in grad school just out of interest, but I was struggling at them. I didn't even complete the class for various reasons, but had I completed, I would have perhaps gotten a C or B or something. They were making me read sheet music and it was just difficult. But now I feel like I play my own keyboard just as a form of stimming in a way similar to what Daniel mentioned, how drumming is like stimming to him. So I'm not trained and I cannot really play well all the time. But sometimes when I'm in the zone, I can play well and it's just unpredictable. But regardless of whether I play well or not well according to the world's tastes, it's still very delightful to me to play and stim that way. So I think yeah, that's kind of delightful when I'm in the zone. Yeah, especially.
Yeah. I'm surprised you didn't mention your art too, Irfan, which I think is also quite delightful.
Oh yeah, thanks.
Daniel?
Yeah, I love this question. Also, just picking up the thread from the chat is like capitalism wants us to be productive all the time, and I think in that way, like disabled people or neurodivergent people are just we're just a problem, right? We're at odds with that because we just want to be human rather than being like a production machine. I think everybody wants to be human rather than being a production machine. But we might not fit those molds of stereotypes of like what is productive in certain spaces. And that's a problem. Even though like the world is productive enough, we could all do less and there's abundance. It's just about how that abundance is distributed and it's not distributed in fair ways. So picking up the joyful piece, I think curiosity. Like I just love learning stuff all the time. I just feel interested in everything. And I definitely tie that to like neurodivergence from like, oh, what can I learn about this? What can I learn about this? There's like this silly, I don't remember which comic it was, but there's this little comic where it's like, there's two guys and they're like, oh, look, it's a whole bunch of nerds. And it's like, you think they're going to bully them? And it's like, let's go learn from them. And I just resonate with that. Like whatever someone's into, like I want to learn all about that and kind of nerd out about it. And I think that's fun.
I definitely agree with the curiosity thing. I can become interested in just about any topic. I'll have one question, I'll do one internet search, and the next thing you know, I'm reading an entire Wikipedia page, and I'm reading it aloud to everyone else in the room, and everyone else in the room is going, "We're done now, it's okay." And I'm like, but it's so interesting. There's a lot of joy to be had just from learning new things, whether you need to learn them or not.
And I think you touch on such a great thing that I think we all share, which is we get a lot of joy out of what people might consider seemingly trivial things, because there is a lot of joy to be had. Maybe because we're primed to see all of those things in really interesting ways. The world is always interesting. We have a few more comments from Lance. Lance talks about how last year they were on vacation to California, and on that vacation, they talked to a random PhD student at UC Berkeley about mathematical logic and her research. She was a logician as well. And they were 14 at the time, so I'm guessing they're 15 now. And from what I'm hearing, it's about that curiosity, just talking to people on the street and not feeling like you have to be in your lane because you're just that interested, and how that brings about meaningful conversations and collaborations and all these other things that actually are great to have in a workplace. And I saw this other thing, Daniel, when you were mentioning some of these, I guess the meme culture or whatever, but there's some of these things that I saw about how people talk about the sort of the deficiencies of neurodivergence, but actually accommodating for neurodivergence is actually good for everybody. So sensory, all of these other things, they're all good for everyone. It just makes everyone more comfortable. So it's not like it's specific, it just so happens that we notice them more. Before we move on to our audience questions, I wanted to tie this all up to bring us back to kind of mathematics and talk a little bit about one of the things you said, Daniel, which was around how had it been a decade before, the conversation right now would be very different. I wonder for each of you, have you just, I'm guessing you have, but have you disclosed, and I know, Sarah, you've said that you have received accommodations, but have you disclosed your neurodivergence at work in a professional setting or asked for accommodations? And how has that affected your experience there? And I have a personal interest in this because this is maybe my first most public, quote unquote, coming out of my neurodivergence. I have not necessarily spoken about it at length with people at work. Most people don't know. So I'm just wondering what your experiences were, given that you're in the mathematical or academic field.
Obviously, disclosing is, a very personal decision. There are pros and cons. I have to disclose at the very least, well, when I was in school, I had to disclose at the very least to whoever was in charge of approving my accommodations, because otherwise I couldn't get the accommodations. That's how the Americans with Disabilities Act works. But I have generally been in the habit, since I was 12 and first found out about all these diagnoses, of just talking about them possibly more often than anyone else wants to hear about them, because if I don't, then people won't get used to them and realize that they're normal. So one of my goals in life is to just normalize all of the various neurodivergences and disabilities I experience, because I'm not the only one who has them, and they should not be treated as something that we can't talk about. So that's my strategy, is just to talk about it all the time.
Irfan, Daniel, any thoughts?
I think for me, when I was getting diagnosed, I was also learning how there's kind of a need for autistic people to help in the kind of research that's happening or the kind of discourse that's going on about autism in the world right now. So that's actually how I even met Sarah about 4 years ago in the first place, through a common friend, because she was already somewhat publicly working in a research advisory board for an autism researcher at Delaware. And then I also started working in that research advisory board. And so once I was already doing that, I felt like that it was kind of my moral responsibility to use the academic credentials I have to start talking about these things publicly anyway. Not since all mathematicians have website, they can personal websites where they can just talk about things. So I just created my website and started talking about autism. So I think like Sarah, I was just also thinking that we should all just be talking about this so we all know what are the different kinds of strengths or challenges that different people face. And we don't always, what's the word, pathologize people's traits. We see how they function. So I think being in math and having already gotten my PhD had given me a certain amount of privilege to be able to talk about it publicly, which I think I could not have done, or I perhaps could not have disclosed it that comfortably with the world had I gotten diagnosed even 5 years ago. I mean, 5 years before, whenever I was diagnosed. I was diagnosed 4 years ago, so I should not say that. But yeah.
Yeah. So for me, being open about neurodiversity and disability are both relatively new things. I dropped a couple links in the chat. I don't know how folks see those, but one is this group Signs of Disability that I co-lead with Lizette Torres-Gerald. We're focused on disability, neurodivergence, chronic illness, all those things in math and trying to build community with one another. So if you identify, please connect with us there. It would be really wonderful. And I've told a bit of my story in that space. And then more recently with sort of backlash around Tylenol and autism and all the ridiculous things that are in the news. I wrote an op-ed about that. So I guess that's the most public thing I've ever done around neurodiversity. But it's complicated because in the workspace, it's mixed. Like people who know me at a personal level know all of these things. I don't know that I go around advertising different aspects. I think especially, I live with a rare chronic illness, physical disabilities, other things. Like it's always kind of been a need to know basis. And I think my experience with getting any support or accommodations has been very, very mixed. I was ill a lot in college, missing weeks sometimes. I had this summer fellowship and I basically had migraines for like 3 months and did nothing. Like the lab manager was understanding, but there was not like a formal accommodation. I actually left engineering just because the physical demands of working in optics were not something that I could do. And I had no idea that like maybe there was an accommodation that could have helped me actually stay in the field. I was just like, oh, guess I can't do this, better quit. So I think that was challenging. And I've only ever asked for formal accommodations in my workplace once, which were denied. So one of the things I have in one of my offices is I have a treadmill desk because sitting down for a long time is physically painful. And I tried to get one for my actual on-campus office, but I was told that would be a safety and liability risk. So that could not happen. So I honestly have not had great experiences in some of those spaces. I think I'm very privileged. Not like it's much easier to be open now that I have got tenure and I'm a full professor. And in some ways, that's I think what has pushed me to be more open is to say like there are disabled folks, right? There are neurodivergent folks in these spaces, whether or not we disclose it. But I think it's really important to try to show newer folks that like you're not alone or like you're not the only one trying to do this. And it might not necessarily be easy, but that doesn't mean that you can't also be successful. And also what success looks for everyone is going to be different.
I just want to add, for anyone who like doesn't feel safe coming out about a disability in the workplace, in school, in life in general, safety first. Like if you don't need accommodations and you don't think it's a very welcoming environment, no judgment if you want to keep that information to yourself. But I do think that those of us who are in a position where we can safely disclose our disabilities, maybe we don't quite have a responsibility to do so, but I think it's a very good idea for us to do so, so that we can advocate not only for ourselves, but for anyone who isn't in a position where they can speak for themselves.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, and I think, yeah, personal choice and how you feel like you want to disclose or not want to disclose, and absolutely with understanding, like a commenter here, hard worker 5263 has talked about how employers are not required to provide accommodations for anything, even though it seems to be a common belief that they are required to do so. This includes physical diversity as well. So formal accommodations may or may not be offered, and so it's good to remember that depending, on the field you're in, the workplace you're in, obviously gauge what acceptance is, what acceptance levels are already out there, and yeah, it's definitely a personal experience. Thank you so much. So this is the end of our guided panel session. I'll be opening it up to our audience here. So please feel free to share your questions on YouTube chat, and we'll be reading them out, or for those attending in Zoom, if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll be calling you one by one, and you can start a discussion with our panelists. Any questions about math or neurodivergence or something in the middle? Please share. We have a lot of comments here. I don't know if any of you would like to speak directly. I'm seeing Matt and Grady in the comments. Matt, hi.
So I will point out, in addition to one of my, I wrote two comments, but the first one, I have another comment related to that I will say, and that is that when I was a graduate student, I listed my name as a potential tutor, and got very few students asking for me to tutor them, partly because when I was asked before that, I charged too little for what ended up happening, which was basically the student didn't really want to do the work. They wanted to play basketball, bounce a basketball while we met. And I didn't know how to deal with that as a student, as a graduate student. But then when I set a much higher rate, I think I only had one student, but she was a dyslexic student. And we met at 7 in the morning before I went to teach my 8 o'clock classes all summer. And she really liked the tutoring, but so did I, because I was getting paid pretty well to just watch her and make sure that she fixed her mistakes. That's what she wanted me to do. She would solve the problems on the board, and when she had a mistake, we talked about it, but I didn't really have to put much time in, because her goal was to fix the mistakes that come from the dyslexia, and she liked how I did it. I didn't ask her to do it that way, she did. And then the comment I wrote here is that when I became a faculty member here in Rolla, Missouri, I met a colleague. We ended up working together for a very long time on many projects. And early on, he told me he was dyslexic. And I concluded from our interactions that was helping, in the following sense. I mean, he had dealt with his disability I don't know, should I call it a disability? Neurodivergence. He had dealt with that neurodivergence for a long time, but what it did was it forced him to check his work on the fly. And it made him slow down enough so that I could find out what he was thinking from what he said and what he wrote, because he was constantly looking back at what he wrote to try to fix it in case he got something written wrong. I learned from that and so I started doing the same thing in my classes, in my lectures. I slowed down, and I constantly was looking back at the previous line, glancing back to look for mistakes. And I made them. I've never been diagnosed with dyslexia, although I do have a brother and a sister who have been diagnosed with dyslexia. And that was before I was in college. Yeah. So I really like the stories that you guys are telling about the way that your neurodiversity or the adaptations that you've made personally to try to address them have been actually helping you. But and yet it's also very important that we all hear how it's difficult to live in society, or not live, but to progress in our society without proper accommodations and acceptance of neurodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, for sharing.
I
your
do want to just quickly comment on something Matt said, that it is okay to call something a disability. It's not like, we should recognize that some things can be disabling, and it also is a function of your surroundings and how accommodating the surroundings are. So for a dyslexic person, if they are working in an accommodated environment, then that's a situation where their strengths start showing up. But if they were not in that situation, then the situation itself would be disabling. So this is kind of why a lot of the medical research has been shifting away from the medical model of disability to social model of disability, where a disability is not something inherently inside you that's disabling, but it's something that happens in society, where had you gotten some accommodations to the thing you were previously disabled with visibly, is not really burdening you that much anymore, and in some cases even giving you strength. So yeah, it is okay to call something a disability, but there is a lot of nuance to that.
Yeah, I think I realize that it's not, that it's okay to call it that, but it's common in society, and has been my whole life, for it to be a hurtful comment. And so I like the term diversity better, but I've used it all my life until I learned, or I used the word disability all my life until I began to learn that there are other ways to say it. And then I slip up once in a while, because I try to avoid things that I'm kind of sure that a lot of people that I talk to will be feel hurt by the standard term. I try to adjust my language. Yeah.
And I think that you bring up a good point of how it affects the terms that we use, and also social versus medical terms, and what feels more empowering to the people we're speaking to. And when we feel comfortable and the people around us feel comfortable, if we can pick words that are more inclusive, it's always great to do that. I did want to shift to one of the questions we got on YouTube. This was from Lance, and they ask, as an autistic teen right now, what do you think I can expect once I enter university and academia?
So we all know the saying, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. I can tell you that in my experience, moving to a new place and being surrounded by new people is rough. All of my routines went out the window. I needed a lot of support to remember to do things like eat and shower and take my meds. So if that's the kind of thing you struggle with when there are big changes, have a plan for how to deal with that, because I didn't have a plan and it was bad.
Fair point, and yeah, good advice. Definitely something I've learned the hard way. Daniel, anything you would want to add to that?
Yeah, that's good advice. I mean, I think There's been struggles along the way, all along the way, and I think that's true of academia, but that's probably true of other fields or other things that you might try to go into. I think the thing that has helped me has trying to figure out what works for me in academia and what doesn't work for me, and try to like shift my focus and work in that way. Like being on a bunch of committees, sitting in lots of meetings, like I just can't do it. It's just very hard for me to focus. It feels oppressive in some ways, if I can use that language. I'm just like, that is not my strength, right? But I can do different things behind the scenes. I can focus on writing, I can focus on other stuff. And so I think I've just tried really hard to sort of craft my own path through academia in a way that leans into my strengths and tries to not force the things that are hard for me. And that was harder to do in grad school. It got easier to do when I was a postdoc. It got a little bit easier when I was a faculty member. And so sort of for me, the further I've gotten in my career, the easier it has been to do that. But it definitely wasn't always easy.
Yeah. And I think it also depends on the career or field you're in, because depending on what that role looks like, whether you need autonomy or structure or flexibility, those things can change throughout the different steps of your career. We have about 2 or 3 more questions. I just wanted to do a quick time check how our panelists are doing for time here. I would love to just get to all of the questions, but want to make sure you have the time to stay on. Sarah's nodding. Irfan's giving us a thumbs up. Daniel's nodding. Okay, good. Ted, you have your hand raised.
Yes, indeed. First of all, I'd like to thank you guys. This was so enjoyable and so enlightening. I couldn't have imagined this going in, better. I want to share that one thought that keeps recurring as I listen to you is the idea of process rather than product. Okay, and let me be a little more precise here. That the more I open my mind to the experiences of neurodivergence, especially in the context of mathematics as a learner of mathematics, the more this notion that mathematics is not a collection of facts or a set of results or endpoints, but rather it's a way of being in the world, a perspective of the world, is strengthened. And as a teacher, it guides me to see this in my students, and that there's as many perspectives, at least as many perspectives as there are people, and probably more, because we keep changing our perspectives as well. And that so math is this thing that can hold all of those together. I love this for myself. It just enriches my experience of mathematics to just see it from the point of view of the learner and of whatever sort of path you follow in that. With that in mind, I do want to ask if you have advice and ideas, perhaps inspired from your own school experiences, so going back to even before college, but also, of course, in your teaching in college, how we, as teachers of mathematics, as communicators of mathematics, can be more inclusive and more understanding of neurodivergence and almost see it as the resource that it offers us. Diversity, I think, is a greatly underappreciated resource in all its forms. So if you have suggestions for that. And one final plug, if there's a time, I would love for Daniel to say a little bit more about his book, because I've long thought that mathematics, possibly other fields as well, but mathematics for sure is a field replete with neurodivergence forever. And so it would be lovely to hear something about that. Thank you.
I could speak to that really quickly. So this book is coming out hopefully later this year with 619 Reith. They're a very interesting new publisher in math and math education. If you're not familiar with them, I'll drop a link and you should check them out. And so the book is focused on sort of disability and difference broadly. in math, and so that could be neurodiversity, sort of what people maybe more traditionally think of disabilities like deaf and blind mathematicians and so forth. And so I think there's about 50 people in there through history, nobody who's alive. And it was an interesting challenge for me because I feel like neurodiversity is often erased from math history, yet we know that neurodivergence is probably it's statistically significantly higher in the mathematics community than in other communities. So we have this strange conundrum, and I'm like, I don't want to like retrospectively diagnose these mathematicians from hundreds of years ago that feels problematic. So I'm trying to figure out the best way to handle that. But I think there's examples. I mean, Newton is probably one of the most obvious examples, but folks like Kurt Gödel, Erdős, Alan Turing were like, there's a lot of empirical evidence and documentation around the ways that their behavior was consistent with neurodivergence. And so I think to just ignore all of those things is also problematic. So I'm trying to like walk this middle ground of like we can't go back and diagnose in the past, but actually let's see all the ways that these differences are present in math history. In both in mathematicians you've probably never heard of, and folks who are quite famous and that many in the math community be familiar with, but we don't think about in that way, right? And so sort of taking a lens that challenges exist, but also there's strengths that come from that difference. So yeah, that's the hope, is to try to put something positive out there that like rather than just us being invisible in the math community, which I think is a problem.
I think that it's possible to have a few neurodivergent traits here and there without qualifying for a diagnosis, because in the DSM there it'll say you have to have at least 3 of these 5 or something like that. So I think that it is probably possible to say, this historical person who isn't alive anymore demonstrably did this thing that is consistent with a particular neurodivergent trait. We don't know whether they were neurodivergent, but they had that trait and they were there and they existed and they did math. And I think that's, probably still a good way of representing neurodiversity throughout history.
I wanted to interject and bring us back to maybe Ted's question a little bit, which was around what steps we can take in the classroom based on your personal experiences in classrooms that teachers or communicators could take in order to make mathematics more accessible, or any other topic as well, but specifically mathematics.
So I think someone mentioned earlier that accommodations for disabled people or neurodivergent people are generally not just good for those people, but just good for everyone, right? So just basic things like providing notes for what you are teaching, and keeping records of those things, and generally being available to students to just talk about math, because a lot of math is learned by talking with people and not just by reading books or reading lecture notes. Those are helpful for everyone, and especially very helpful for neurodivergent people, especially in the case of notes. If you just write on the blackboard and leave, maybe someone is just so focused on taking notes precisely that they are not even understanding the thing. But then if they don't focus so much on writing things precisely, then they are actually missing details when they are reading later. And these sorts of things are issues that can happen to just anyone, not just neurodivergent people. But I guess some neurodivergent people sometimes struggle disproportionately more because of these issues. Yeah, so we should just generally be good human beings teaching people and giving them all the resources we can. I think it should be illegal to at least not. So what I do, I don't really have time to take everything that I'm teaching. So what I have started doing is I just write on my iPad, and so I don't write on the chalkboard. I just write on the iPad, connect it to the screen, and whatever has been written just gets shared later. And I try to write hopefully legibly to my students. Yeah.
Great.
The most accessible classes I ever took in math had take-home open book, open note exams. Basically, you have a week to do this exam. It takes however many hours it takes. None of the questions will be found directly, well, none of the answers to the questions will be found directly in the textbook, because it's not going to be prove this theorem that's proved in the textbook. It's do you understand the consequences of the theorems enough to apply them to novel problems? I loved those exams. I found them very fun. In grad school, I struggled a lot more because the homework questions would be like that. And then the exam questions would just be, have you memorized this proof of this important theorem? And no, I haven't, because I spent all my free time doing the homework. I didn't have time to memorize the proof of the theorem. I understand how to use the theorem. I have not memorized the proof. So having consistent, I don't know, question styles, for lack of a better term, across homework and exams so that students can be prepared even if they don't have time to both do the homework and separately study, so helpful.
This is so true, and I'm having a visceral reaction to what could have happened had I had that, because yeah, I'd always struggled with the difference between the different questions, where memorization never came easily to me unless I was genuinely curious about it. And I was usually, even if I didn't do well in the math itself, when it was like more logical, I did really well. So even though I really struggled with math all my life, when I went to grad school, I did really well with data analytics, for example, because it was more logic and pattern recognition than it was memorizing formula. So yeah, really great examples. Daniel, would you like to add anything to that?
I have too much to say on this topic. This has been my area of research for the last decade. The chat, I think I would just say, unfortunately, a lot are pushed out of math because of poor math instruction, right? Rather than making it creative, beautiful, engaging, and make it dull and punitive. And we also treat exams or just assessment though it's objective, but actually the choices that we make are pretty arbitrary on how we're going to assess math. And even folks who do assessment for a living recognize it's actually difficult to really accurately understand what someone knows mathematically, right? It's not easy to measure that in an effective way, but we're just like, well, I made this test, I decided to do it this way, you didn't do it, so therefore you don't know it. I think it's problematic. So yeah, I dropped 200 pages in the chat. Feel free to dive into them.
I wonder, I was gonna reply in the chat, but since we're, we let our hair down, as it were, at this point, we're at the end of the event, right? We can just interrupt briefly. I wonder if you could say something, Daniel, in your experience about why you think that is. Why do we, as teachers of mathematics, focus so much on assessing and measuring the difficult, we're putting ourselves up against maybe an impossible end that's possibly also ill-defined, that's causing our incomplete answers or attempts at finding proxies are causing more problems than they're solving. So why are we doing it?
I think there's this logic, it's sort of this logic of weed out culture, right? Is we have to find the bad ones and get rid of them so the best and the brightest can thrive. And I think that type of thinking is common in math and in ways, but it's problematic. And then I think there's sort of the flip side is also problematic, where it's standards don't matter, just do anything. And it's we need to both push people to think deeply in a mathematical way, but also support rather than weed out. So I could probably give a whole speech about that, but I think that's my short version.
I guess one of the ways I tried to accommodate that was, Sarah, you mentioned take-home exams. Before I retired, well, for many years before I retired from teaching, I gave tests in two parts. One part was in class and one part was take-home. Pretty much for that kind of reason, that some people are slower thinkers and can plod through the details better outside the classroom, and I want them to do that. And they show their strengths better that way. And then other students are really quick at recalling the things that they're supposed to recall from a class, and you can test for that in the class. Unfortunately, education has moved to a point where the standard is to give homework from a book that's electronically delivered and very trivial mostly. And when it's not trivial, it's wrong, or a lot of the times it's wrong. And even when it's trivial, it's often wrong. And it grades things incorrectly, telling students that they have the correct answer when they don't, telling them they have the right answer, the wrong answer. Sorry, the right answer when they, let's see. Oh, yeah, telling them they have the wrong answer when they have it right. And as instructors, when we have a bigger class, we don't have time to go in and fix the program because we don't write the code. And you're expected to meet all the students' complaints. And if you're trying to do that, then you never get anything else done for the class or for the research or for the rest of your life, like having children and being a father or grandfather, mother or grandmother, etc., relationships and so forth. So I don't think that the current climate is yet matured in terms of supporting instructors or students in that sense.
Matt, you bring up actually a great segue to a question that Grady asked. Grady, if you'd like to speak to it.
Yeah, I have a very broad view of mathematicians and the math community because math and mathematicians are really identified in society as being persons and a group of a particular and distinctive and obviously very high level of thinking ability, so that the community and the members are regarded in a somewhat elite way and therefore somewhat intimidating and so on and so forth. So what mathematicians do and how they think and how they speak about issues, I think because of the status and the perception that you enjoy in society has a particular weight and a strategic advantage. So that is why when I raised the question about your relationship and how you regard the conversation in society about identity politics. It is a hot and raging issue. And what you bring to that conversation as a special distinctive is that differences are not, they are far beyond and bigger and more nuanced. And unfortunately, also, when not looked at in the right way, insidious, than the more obvious differences, like in race, for example. So because of the regard that I have for your thoughtfulness and your ability to deal with complexity, that's my general definition of mathematicians. They have a competence to deal with that. What pluses do you think your math journey as a neurodivergent person can make to the conversation in society about identity politics and difference?
And takers. Great question, Grady.
Grady, could you say a bit more about what you mean by identity politics here?
Identity politics,
Like
almost for me personally, about racism and race discrimination. A movement of justice that stands out in American history is certainly that, but not only, of course, that of African Americans. And it's the identification of yourself, at least in our case, which I think is somewhat extreme, as just being an equal human being. Okay. I mean, that's ground zero. So that's the framing of identity politics in America is around the worth of a human being. What I'm asking now to you, as a member of the math community, you are obviously not like persons of color were regarded as inferior. You're often regarded as having a superior intellect, though in your case, you are challenged in certain ways in the way that you use your intellect. So, I mean, your story and your testimony about what difference means in society and how do you think about it? Because first and foremost, your stories on the panel have been about how your difference in the way that you think and can think has influenced you and your work. So you have a personal experience with how differences at a very subtle and nuanced level actually affects people's lives. You're also speaking about how your difference in the way that you think and how you identify yourself as a mathematician who also happens to be neurodivergent, how that enters a conversation in the math community about teaching, research, and so on and so forth. I just see you in my question in the chat, I said strategic. You have a strategic contribution to make to the conversation because of the situation that you're in.
Yeah, I feel like that's the kind of feeling I had when I said that I felt a moral responsibility to start talking about this now that I have an academic website and have a PhD. It is true that academics, especially mathematicians, their views are valued a bit differently than just a random civilian on the street. And so in that sense, if academics are not talking about the issues that surround us, then it seems like then we would be heading in a really dark future. So I think I do agree that we mathematicians could be strategic additions to issues in the world if we had the privilege. Not all mathematicians have the privilege. If we had the privilege to be able to talk about how both the social structures in the world have been unhelpful sometimes, and how the structures themselves are flawed sometimes to begin with. If we don't talk about it, then it's really, I imagine it's not a good future. I'm not just talking about mathematicians, but I'm talking about academics in general.
Thank
But
you.
that said, not everyone can talk about it, and that's really important to recognize. Not everyone is in a position of privilege to be able to talk about all sorts of things.
May I just say something briefly about your last statement that everybody's not in a position to talk about it. And that goes to the very point of that I want to make about my enthusiasm about the power and influence that mathematicians such as yourself have at this particular moment. I think for persons who are not going to protest, who are not going to lobby about diversity, equity, and inclusion in society, there is a huge space that you can enter and use your thinking ability and your awareness of your identity within the math community and your awareness of the politics of identity within the math community, because your stories are also telling that story, because there are political implications just throughout everything that you're talking about regarding accommodation and so forth. So I think that for the person who is not politically inclined, there's a big role that they can play. And one, like we're doing here, giving your personal testimony about your experience as a human being within the math community, and then using your math acuity and your mathematical way of thinking as a way of getting to the very core and dynamics of difference and differentiation as such, as a concept. Just take it and go with it. I mean, mathematicians are very good analysts, and you could engage the matter of difference and differentiation. I'm even thinking about a calculus of difference, where you're talking about in social terms and interaction terms, using the analogy from calculus, where you talk about differentiation and then the integral, how things are separated and distinct, and then how they come together as wholes. And for you to be able to talk about your experience as a mathematician within that metaphor to other mathematicians, and to make those kinds of interventions in every setting that you can access.
Thank you, Grady. I think I do recognize your passion in this, and what you're sharing is definitely really good suggestions. And I think our panelists probably could say a lot more about their own personal journeys, recognizing that each person's journey is different, and how they want to represent in whatever community and identify with it is obviously a personal choice. And in each of our own comfort levels, we all have different ways that we can contribute. So thank you for sharing the different ways we could contribute. I really appreciate it. Sarah had to leave. There were a few more questions, but in the essence of time, I think we'll be wrapping things up now. Before we end, if there are any final comments from our remaining panelists, Irfan, Daniel, anything you'd like to share about things you're working on? I know, Daniel, you talked about your book and a bunch of other things. Irfan, anything you'd like to share about some things you're working on, either in this space or in your professional or personal life, that you'd like to highlight for us?
Well, I'm just trying to finish up a paper for almost the last 1 year, so hopefully I'll just finish it soon. But that's the work I've been doing since moving to Toronto, so it's kind of important for me to finish it. So that's what I'm working on.
For all of us here, would you like to share what that paper is on?
Sorry?
Would you like to share the topic or the thesis at all, just to give us a quick context, just the title?
So I work in non-standard analysis, and I'm now trying to understand some basic machine learning things with non-standard perspectives. And I think the tentative title is Hyperfinite Neural Networks.
And how does it, for a non-mathematician like me, how does it apply to the world from how you see it? I understand because I've heard machine learning, but
I'm not 100% sure about that, because I'm right now just trying to understand a very simple mathematical structure, but I don't really, since I'm not a machine learning researcher myself, I don't really know what's going on in the current cutting edge applications of machine learning. So this is kind of my, the whole last year was kind of a learning period for me to kind of get my foot in. So after this paper, hopefully I'll be trying to learn more machine learning and then trying to get to more of how it can be applicable. But right now I'm focused just on the math. I don't even know
Yeah, that's fair.
how the current world systems are like, I don't know the actual theory of current world systems, and I think a lot of it is empirical. So we collectively, the mathematicians working in machine learning, are trying to come up with theories for how a lot of the things that do work right now actually work.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't
And
think
I guess,
anyone really fully understands machine learning yet, even the people who work in machine learning.
yeah. Well, thank you. And I think it's maybe a great way to remember that a lot of research starts there with a absolutely great way of saying, I don't necessarily know, but this is how we're going to go. And then in time, we will find what fruit that tree bears, so to speak. So thank you, Irfan, for sharing. Thank you, Daniel. Sarah's not here, but thank you, Sarah, for joining us. You've been amazing panelists. I've learned a lot. I hope our audience has as well. And we'll be sharing a follow-up email with some of the stuff we've talked about, some of the links, maybe a short survey. But that's for later. Thank you for taking the time and spending the time with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you, Namista.